So having heard a really challenging and thought-provoking piece from Rob, we'll now switch to a situation where how can we redress that balance? How can we see people on the front line having some influence over their safety and how they're looked after? So it's now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Donna Cohen to you to talk about the merits of bottom-up-led organisations. So over to you, Donna. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. I'll just share my screen. Hope you can see that now. So yeah, look, thank you very much for the introduction, Joji, and thank you also to the organisers of the conference for the invitation to participate. I think you're going to find this is a very different style of presentation to what we just heard, the fascinating presentation we just heard from Rob. I'd like to actually start by acknowledging that I'm joining you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the area now known as East Melbourne. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any elders of other communities that might be present today. And I also want to acknowledge that I am not joining you today as an expert on safety and risk, with a long list of qualifications and publications that demonstrate my credentials. I'm certainly not any kind of expert on safety and risk in the aviation sector. Indeed, if you've read my biographical notes on the conference website, you might be wondering why I'm here at all. For those of you who haven't read my bio, I started out as a biomedical research scientist with a PhD in biochemistry, followed by 12 years of research in both Australia and the US. I left research to become a professional actor, as you do. And when that lost its allure, I completed a master's in public policy and management, and then spent a couple of years working in the Victorian Public Service in the area of biotechnology and ethics, during which time I managed a human research ethics committee. Anyway, after a couple of years in the public service, I went back to academia to run a strategic projects unit for the Dean of Medicine, Nursing and Health Sciences at Monash University, before striking out on my own as a consultant about 14 years ago. Now, more by accident than by design, my consulting work took me into the fields of quality improvement and program evaluation, which is what our Meerkat tool can be used for. And I discovered along the way that I have a genuine affinity for these endeavors. This is probably not all that surprising, given my brain has been programmed since my early 20s to collect and analyze data and then use that evidence as the basis for deciding what to do next, which is pretty much what quality improvement and program evaluation entails. Now, I tell you all this about my background because it helps you as the audience to understand where I'm coming from in the ideas I'm going to put forward in the next 30 minutes or so. And there are probably three key takeaways from my journey. Firstly, if I had to describe my worldview, it would be a perspective born of the scientific method. And for those of you who may not be familiar with this term, there may not be any of those people present, but it refers to an empirical, that is an experiential or experimental method of knowledge acquisition that starts with developing an hypothesis that's then tested through some mode of data collection. As a researcher, I worked at the laboratory bench doing experiments that yielded an assortment of data, but data can be acquired through a broad range of quantitative and qualitative techniques. Importantly, once the data has been collected, it's then analyzed and interpreted and used to confirm, amend, or refute the hypothesis. Now, the scientific method is undoubtedly flawed. The flaws come in the potential for skewed or biased data collection, and also the potential for cherry-picking data, faulty data analysis, and biased or incomplete interpretation of findings. Apart from that, it's perfect. But seriously, even so, I think it is the best option we have as human beings as the starting point and underpinning philosophy for understanding the world that we live in. It's also the best option we have for the design, implementation, and evaluation of public policy, for safety and risk management, and for quality improvement. Anyway, my main point here is that as I've reflected on current approaches to quality, safety, and risk management, I've brought that scientific perspective to my analysis. And I've concluded that the evidence is telling us the current approaches are not achieving the desired outcomes, and we need a thorough rethink and reboot of these endeavors. And I'm going to come back to these points later. The second take home is that while I have several degrees and have done many things over the last 40 years, you will have noticed that I have never done any formal training in safety and risk management, quality improvement, or program evaluation. What I know about these things, I've learned in the context of having to apply them in the projects that I've worked on. So I most definitely bring an outsider's perspective. But it's an outsider's perspective that brings together experience across a broad range of settings and contexts. I've worked in research, in the arts, in education and training, in government and public policy, in academia, and more recently as a consultant to organizations in the health and higher education sectors, including for strategic planning and for the design, implementation, and evaluation of programs and initiatives. I have even been the most overqualified receptionist and filing clerk that several Melbourne organisations have ever seen when I was doing temp office work to subsidise my fledgling career as a professional actor. So I really do know what it means to be one of the low-paid and often overlooked workers at the organisation's front line. Now, this range of experience has definite advantages because it's allowed me to develop an unusual level of understanding of the different stakeholder perspectives for any given project or initiative that I've worked on as a consultant over the last 14 years. For instance, I understand the realities of working as a university academic on the one hand, as well as the constraints of government departments and the bureaucracy on the other hand. So this has allowed me to write successful funding applications for university programs to government funding agencies that meet the needs of both the university and government stakeholders. An outsider's perspective has one other thing going for it. I haven't been co-opted to any particular vested interest or point of view, which is what inevitably happens when you become an insider. As an outsider, you can sometimes see the culture of an organization more clearly because you aren't actually part of it and contributing to it, which is not to say I don't bring other biases into the equation. Of course I do, but I'm neither part of the insider groupthink, nor have I bought into the established narrative for how an organization goes about its business. The last take home is probably not all that obvious to the casual observer of my journey, but it's become quite obvious to me as I've reflected on that journey. And that is that in almost everything that I've done since I left my research career 24 years ago, I have not so much been a content expert, more a process expert. That is, I'm able to very quickly develop a good understanding of the steps that are needed to get from a starting point to the desired endpoint without necessarily knowing the detail of what needs to happen at each step. Now, this is quite a useful skill to have as a consultant. It's allowed me to move into a broad range of new contexts and make insightful and valuable contributions to those client organizations. The last thing that I want to tell you about by way of introducing myself is how I got into quality improvement. But before I do, I just want to point out that I am going to be talking a lot about approaches to quality improvement, which on the surface might seem to be a little bit off-piste for a conference about approaches to safety and risk management. However, from my perspective, these concepts are simply two sides of the same coin. Where high levels of safety and appropriately managed risks are the desired outcomes, quality improvement is the means by which these are achieved. Everything you do to improve safety in the workplace is about first identifying those aspects of work systems that are unsafe or represent potential safety hazards, and then implementing measures to reduce or eliminate the risk to safety, that is, to improve the level of safety. And likewise, quality improvement activities don't happen in a vacuum, undertaken simply for the purpose of saying you're doing quality improvement. Although when you look closely at how some sectors approach quality improvement, you'd have to wonder. Ideally, though, quality improvement activities are done for the purpose of shifting a system that isn't working optimally to a more optimal state. And I use the word optimal very deliberately because quality improvement is a journey, not a destination, just as safety and risk reduction are relative terms, not absolute ones. Anyway, back to how I got into quality improvement. The very first contract I won as a consultant back in 2008 was for the Victorian Department of Human Services, which is now the Department of Health, to develop a best practice framework for establishing and maintaining high quality clinical learning environments. Now, if you're not familiar with that term, a clinical learning environment is the learning environment in a clinical setting such as a hospital, health service, or general practice clinic, which is where health professional students, trainees, and staff work with real patients and other clinicians to learn their craft or to further develop their clinical skills. So for this project, we consulted with stakeholders in universities and hospitals, including academics, healthcare professionals, and learners at various levels. And from the data we collected, we developed a framework called the Best Practice Clinical Learning Environment, or BPCLE framework. Now, there were several follow-up contracts to develop performance indicators and a suite of resources to go with the framework. The final contract was to pilot the implementation of the framework in a range of health service settings. You see, the department didn't just want to put the framework out there and hope that health services made use of it. They wanted the implementation of the framework to drive quality improvement in clinical learning environments in the literally hundreds of organizations, including hospitals, community health services, GP clinics, and others that contribute to clinical education and training in the Australian state of Victoria each year. So based on what we learned from stakeholders while developing the framework, we decided the tools to implement that framework should enable organizations to gather a broad cross-section of input from anyone involved in organizing, managing, or delivering clinical education and training. We developed, initially in Microsoft Excel, a process map-based implementation tool that would allow groups of people to collectively assess how well the various aspects of the system are working, then visualize the outcomes of that assessment, and finally translate those outcomes into a quality improvement action plan. We coined the term map-enabled experiential review, which is the MIR in Meerkat, to describe the technique. Anyway, to cut a long story short, the managers and staff who participated in the implementation pilot loved the tool, and we proceeded to develop an online version called BPCLE tool, which is now used across Victoria and in some other Australian jurisdictions as well. But during the pilot, several health service quality managers who sat in on the map-based assessment sessions took us aside afterwards and asked if the same approach could be used to assess other work processes, both clinical and non-clinical, which is how we came to develop Meerkat, an online application that can be tailored to any work process or context, and of course is how I came to focus on quality improvement in the health sector over the last 8 years. Being the scientist I basically am, I was keen to see some research done to determine whether this map-based approach of engaging frontline staff in issue identification and resolution actually worked as a facilitator of quality improvement in a healthcare setting. So my colleagues wrote a research proposal, obtained a small grant, and conducted a research trial of MIR in 2 clinical areas of a busy Melbourne hospital. Bottom line, the use of the MIR approach over a 10-month period increased staff interest and engagement in quality improvement activities and resulted in a statistically significant 34% reduction in independently monitored adverse events in the 2 participating units. The research was published in BMJ Open Quality in April 2020. And yes, that's right, that was 2 years ago, just as the pandemic was taking over everybody's life. I'd like to be able to report that seeing how the MIR approach is actually an evidence-based approach, unlike the majority of quality improvement activities in healthcare, hundreds of hospitals are now using Meerkat to improve the quality and safety of the clinical care they provide. But alas, that is not the case. There are a few, but not many. Undoubtedly, the timing for publication of the journal article hasn't helped, since most hospitals in Australia and probably everywhere else in the world are just struggling to keep functioning, never mind attempting to introduce a new approach to quality improvement. However, for anyone familiar with publishing in the peer-reviewed literature, you'll know that date of publication is often quite a long time after data have been analysed. Indeed, we knew back at the end of 2018 that the MIR approach was successful. And we've been talking about the approach and showcasing Meerkat for nearly 18 months before the pandemic became an issue. So we can't blame everything on the pandemic. Something else is at play here. And there are two important pieces of context to help us understand what might be going on. First, quality and safety in the healthcare sector has been in the spotlight for over 25 years, and not just in Australia. Every few years, another report is written detailing the same issues. And the response? Well, it's also basically just more of the same. New indicators, different reporting frameworks, beefed up accreditation regimes, changes to governance. And while these things are important, and there has been some progress, the problems persist, with 1 in 9 patients experiencing some kind of adverse event in hospital. And that proportion doubles for patients that stay overnight or longer. So there is definitely a need for some new ideas and new tools to address the problem. And indeed, just as an aside, the most recent report on safety and quality in Victorian hospitals, a 2016 report, hopefully entitled Targeting Zero, was triggered by a series of baby deaths in a Victorian hospital. When the story broke about the deaths, I distinctly recall the hospital spokesperson being interviewed on TV out the front of the hospital, standing in front of the sign that proudly reminded us, this is an accredited hospital. I'll talk more about the shortcomings of accreditation later. The second piece of context is that frontline managers and their teams that actually implement the MIR approach using Meerkat love it, and they want to continue using it. The indifference, or in some cases, downright hostility to the approach comes higher in the organization. Now, this is not actually about our tool and whether it gains traction in the marketplace or not. This is about a significant level of disconnect between the way executives and senior managers view issues of safety and quality and how best to address them versus the way frontline managers and their teams view those same issues. Anyway, because the pandemic has put a significant dent in my consulting activities over the last 2 years, I've actually had a lot of time to think about what I've observed and experienced over the past 8 years of working with organizations in the health sector. I've spoken with many people, both in health and in other sectors, who've experienced the same disconnect, and I've been reading the literature on quality improvement that encompasses many sectors. It's plain to see this is a widespread issue. Of course, there are exemplar organizations in all sectors that buck the trend, but the fact that the problems persist so widely suggests there is something fundamentally flawed in the way organizations operate. As I said earlier, I don't pretend to be any kind of expert on safety and risk management in the aviation industry, but given that BALPA has gone to the trouble of organizing this conference with this particular lineup of speakers, something tells me you have similar problems in play in your industry. It's worth noting at this point that the health and aviation sectors have a couple of important characteristics in common when it comes to considering safety, risk management, and quality improvement. Firstly, adverse events in both healthcare and aviation have the potential to result in loss of life, although fairly obviously the scale of the loss is potentially much greater in aviation and includes loss of expensive equipment as well. Secondly, when adverse events do occur in either healthcare or aviation, they almost always have more to do with problems in the system than to do with individuals in that system. Thirdly, both sectors make use of structured ongoing training for their professionals. And lastly, both have systems for reporting adverse events and near misses. But that's probably where the similarities end. Indeed, numerous authors have pointed out that healthcare has much to learn from aviation when it comes to safety and risk management. Not to be a killjoy, but I suspect that healthcare probably won't make much progress on its improvement journey, no matter how much it tries to emulate aviation, if the sector can't acknowledge and address the underpinning issues that have served to maintain the status quo when it comes to safety and quality. Which brings me to the title of my presentation, Back to Front and Upside Down. For me, this encapsulates what I believe are the fundamental problems with our approach to quality, safety, and risk management. So let's start with upside down. When we think about organizations, how do we envisage them? How do we describe them? Well, we talk about the CEO or general manager being at the top and the frontline workforce being at the bottom. And how do we build organizations? Well, we build them from the top down. First, we hire the CEO or general manager. That person then hires the next level of executives or senior managers to whom the CEO delegates responsibility for the various portfolios of the organization. Those senior managers then hire the next level of managers to whom they delegate the various domains that sit under their particular portfolio. And so on and on until you finally get to the frontline workforce, who are actually the people who will create the products or deliver the services that the organization has been set up to create or deliver. Now, this is all perfectly logical and rational. You can't really argue that this is not an appropriate way to build an organization, except for one small thing. Because this is how we build organizations, this is also the way we manage organizations, including managing the performance of individuals at each tier of the organization. Not only that, but when we train people to be better managers, we reinforce those same principles. And what are the obvious consequences of this? Well, firstly, everyone in the organization looks to the person or people above them in the organization for confirmation that they're doing a good job. After all, that's the person who hired them and who will be assessing their performance and potentially recommending them for a pay rise or promotion. So my job here as a manager in the middle of the organization is to deliver to the manager above me against the responsibilities that have been delegated to me. And the person above me in the hierarchy, well, that person doesn't want to know the details of how I deliver against those objectives, because all he or she is concerned about, in turn, is delivering against the responsibilities that have been delegated to them by the person above them in the hierarchy. This is what's known as managing up. That is creating value for your manager or boss. And it's lauded and applauded as the ideal way to be a great manager or team player. But here's the thing. What happens when you get to the front line? Their job in this schema is to deliver value for their manager. But who's delivering value for them? No one. Now, that's rather unfortunate because the frontline staff are the people who are creating the products or delivering the services. And if the COVID pandemic has taught us one thing, it's that when the frontline falls over, your organization is in trouble. And depending on how essential the goods or services you deliver are to the community at large, your whole society may be in trouble too. So that's the first consequence of building organizations from the top down. Namely, everyone's busy managing up, while no one's focus is on supporting the work of the frontline workforce. The second consequence of building organizations from the top down is that we come to see the people at the top of the organization and in the upper levels of the hierarchy as being much more valuable to the organization than people occupying the lower levels. And we demonstrate this by paying the people at the top an extraordinary multiple of the salaries of the people at the bottom. And because we pay them a lot more, we value their ideas and insights a lot more too. This carries through everything, including when it comes to working out where improvements are needed and what those improvements should be. In fact, we don't even bother asking the frontline workforce. And we rationalize this lack of consultation with people who actually do the work by assuming that frontline staff will just take the opportunity to whinge and complain about the circumstances they're expected to work in. Now, unfortunately, because frontline staff are not afforded meaningful opportunities to contribute their insights and ideas, this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and they do end up standing around complaining about the circumstances they're expected to work in. But let's suppose we were to build organizations the other way. That is, starting with the front line. So here we have the people who build the widgets or deliver the services. Why would this group of people choose to hire one or more people in the role of, let's call it, manager? Well, most likely they would be hiring these people to manage the administrative, payroll, purchasing, and up tasks that need to be done for the group to be able to do their work, but which would take the frontline people away from the job that they've been hired to do. So the raison d'etre for this first line of managers is actually to support the work of the front line. And which direction would these people look for confirmation that they're doing a good job? Up? No, they would look down to the people they're there to support. In turn, why would this level of managers, let's call them that, hire another level of managers? Well, for the same reason. Because there are certain tasks that are common to everyone at that first manager level, and it would be much more efficient if those tasks could be undertaken collectively by a smaller group of managers. And so it would go on, with each level of managers there to support the work of the level that sits below them on this diagram, until finally the person that would be hired for this position at the top would be tasked with the one remaining thing that the whole organization needs, which is someone who can keep an eye on strategic issues, particularly the external operating environment. Now, I'm sure there are plenty of issues with trying to build an organization from the bottom up, and I can't really imagine anyone taking this approach anytime soon. But the point I'm making is that our current and indeed long-standing approach to organizational structure has created the circumstances where the emphasis is completely upside down. Far too much effort, time, and yes, money is invested in keeping the people at the top of organizations happy, often at the expense of the front line. Let me give you a concrete example. In the podcast I did with Nipin late last year, I relayed something told to me by a colleague who works as a frontline healthcare professional in the emergency department of a busy hospital. Now, the hospital executive had recently decided they wanted all the hospital staff to wear the same uniform. They thought it would present a better and more consistent and professional corporate image to patients and hospital visitors if everybody that worked in the hospital could readily be identified by wearing the same attire. Now, just as an aside, the other attractive aspect of this idea was that each staff member would be responsible for purchasing and laundering their own uniforms, thereby saving the hospital considerable amounts of money in laundry costs. Now, the emergency department staff, well, they were not in favor of this, and they indicated they would prefer to be able to continue wearing standard hospital scrubs. But hospital management stood firm and denied their request. It's important to note the ED staff were not just trying to be difficult or buck the corporate professional image. Their concern was that they frequently end up covered in the various bodily fluids and discharges of patients that end up in the ED, and consequently, they may need to change their clothes several times in a shift. Aside from needing to provide several sets of uniforms for themselves to cover this contingency, ED staff were concerned about biohazard implications of taking their dirty uniforms home to launder. So here we have an example of the organization's most senior managers taking a decision that had significant adverse implications for the frontline staff. Not only did they not seek input from the people most affected by the decision, they were unmoved by the entirely reasonable request to reconsider. What is painfully obvious from this example is that the conundrum exercising the minds of the executive team, namely how to create a more professional corporate identity, had really nothing to do with the actual raison d'etre for the hospital, namely providing the safest and most effective way of delivering healthcare services to patients. So the third consequence of the way we build and manage organizations is that the most senior managers often become disconnected from the mission and real world operation of the organization. Since each level of the organization is focused up to the level above it, rather than down to the level they're meant to be supporting, the higher you go in the organization, the more divorced the decisions become from what's needed by the frontline workforce. So you have frontline staff and their managers who understand work as done, while middle and senior managers are trying to deliver outcomes against work as imagined to managers higher up the chain. Well, it doesn't take too much imagination to see how this plays out in safety and risk management and in quality improvement. Indeed, more effort is often expended in managing perceptions of how risks are being handled than in managing the risks themselves. There's more interest in ensuring they're perceived as an organization focused on quality than in taking a proactive and preventative approach to quality improvement. In the short term, this is seen as a cost-effective strategy, something the board and shareholders are likely to applaud. And remember, that's who the CEO and executive team are managing up to. The only problem is that the chickens eventually come home to roost, and sooner or later the risks turn into realities, and the lack of attention to continuous quality improvement can no longer be ignored. Which brings me to the other part of my presentation titled Back to Front, which is how I would describe current approaches to quality, safety, and risk. In the healthcare sector, which I know reasonably well, but in many other sectors too, quality and safety have tended to be reactive to incidents and problems. An adverse event occurs, and a quality project is set up in response to try to identify and address the underlying causes. Unfortunately, in healthcare, each adverse incident that triggers a quality project has already negatively impacted on a patient, perhaps lengthening their hospital stay or causing permanent impairment, or maybe even death. You can see what I mean when I say this is back to front. Shouldn't we take a more proactive and preventative approach to quality, where latent safety threats and sources of protocol variants are identified and then addressed through quality projects before they result in adverse events, thereby potentially preventing avoidable patient harm? I think that a major driver for this back to front approach is that quality and safety have become overly focused on compliance rather than on identifying opportunities for genuine improvement. And because organizations have been pared to the bone through misplaced application of lean and just-in-time principles, which we found out to our cost during the pandemic quickly transform into just too late when we need them most, well, those organizations have limited resources to apply to those compliance activities, and they resort to doing the least they can get away with. This means taking an "it ain't broke, so don't waste time trying to fix it" attitude, which simply ensures that adverse events will have to be the trigger for quality improvement. But it also means a paint to the sightlines preparation for accreditation site visits and tick-a-box use of checklists and templates. As an aside, I don't actually have an issue with checklists and templates per se. And if they're used correctly, these obviate the need for every organization to reinvent every single wheel. The problem with templates is that time-poor managers use them as a shortcut rather than as a starting point, not bothering to ensure that what's in the template properly fits with the circumstances of their own organization. Of course, this push to adopt a compliance-based approach to quality, safety, and risk comes from outside of organizations, not from within, and is usually put in place by regulating authorities that need to satisfy themselves and the public at large that everything works the way it's supposed to. Unfortunately, compliance regimes that are based on a combination of accreditation and performance indicators, as is the case in healthcare, are doomed to fail. This is because, regardless of how good the accreditation regimes are, accreditation is not a guarantee of what will happen at the coalface of service delivery. And also because reliance on indicators, even the best indicators, is akin to measuring the number of horses that have bolted through the open gate. Indeed, our faith in accreditation and performance indicators rests on two heroic assumptions. The first is that systems and processes, once accredited, will be implemented as intended. In reality, this is not the case. And we've even come up with several terms to describe this, including unwanted variability, protocol variance, and normalized deviance. The second assumption is that indicators are an accurate readout on what actually happens at the service delivery coalface. One problem with this assumption is that a lot of protocol variance slips by under the radar because it doesn't immediately result in measurably bad outcomes. Indeed, this is how protocol variance becomes normalized deviance. Another problem is that compliance regimes based on achieving particular indicator benchmarks can provide a powerful incentive for behaviors that achieve the required indicator results, but which are clinically questionable. For example, one way to ensure the hospital's emergency department achieves its benchmarks for patient waiting times is simply to send home patients who might otherwise wait a long time. And if you think that doesn't happen, it actually happened to a member of my own family several years ago. The bottom line is that good indicator results don't necessarily mean that everything is working the way it's supposed to. Even if more reliable indicators could be found, using indicators to flag safety and quality issues is an inherently reactive approach. And while improving the response to poor indicator results is a laudable goal, surely the objective is to get better at preventing avoidable harm, not to get better at responding to bad outcomes. This is completely back to front, using lag indicators to tell us what we should be focusing on, whereby until we reach some threshold of unacceptability, we'll allow something bad to continue happening. We shouldn't be waiting for things to go wrong at all. We should be looking on a regular basis at what we're doing and asking the question, how can we do this better? This transforms our thinking from being only problem-oriented towards being more focused on the opportunities that genuine quality improvement provides. Currently, I think we see the improvement of safety and quality as an antidote to harm, instead of seeing it as a good in itself. If we only embark on improvement activities when something has already gone wrong, well, we don't have time to understand what went wrong or the things that led us to that point. And what's more, the people who are involved are feeling defensive about what happened, and they're unlikely to freely reflect on their own actions. Now, I can appreciate why senior managers, regulators, government ministers, and indeed the general public like indicators. In our complex world, we like to find ways to boil everything down to some simple equation. People like the idea that one or two critical data points can tell you in a nutshell that everything's fine or not fine. But actually, the world doesn't work that way. Systems don't work that way. And we should remember the immortal words of H.L. Mencken, that for every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. So by denying the complexity of the systems we work with, or trying to encapsulate everything we need to know in a few KPIs, we're just setting ourselves up for problems and potentially for disaster down the track. And it's also worth reminding ourselves about the adage that's been around in evaluation circles for some time, namely that not everything that is important about a system can be measured by an indicator, and the flip side of this, not everything that can be measured by an indicator is necessarily all that important to the system. So I've spent the last 25 minutes or so telling you why I think our approaches to quality, safety, and risk are upside down and back to front. The fact that these approaches have persisted and been the status quo for so long tells us they're working for someone. And you don't have to be a Nobel Prize winner to figure out that the people the system is working for include the decision makers at the top of organizations. Operating their organizations through top-down command and control and waiting until there's an actual problem in front of you that needs to be fixed, well, these approaches certainly work better for the budget bottom line in the short term, even if the reality is that the apparent benefits are short-lived and unsustainable. I know this is a very cynical thing to say, but, well, the facade only needs to stand up long enough for executive bonuses to be paid. Indeed, those exemplar organizations that have successfully shifted their approach have been able to do so because the boards, executives, and senior managers realize there's a better and more sustainable way to operate. And coincidentally, returning to my earlier point about the challenges we've faced with our Meerkat tool, the healthcare organizations that have taken up subscriptions are the ones where the push to use the MIR approach has come from an executive team member. And what is it those exemplar organizations have come to understand? It's that the solution to both the upside down and the back to front conundrum is the same. It's the front line. It all comes down to how middle and particularly senior managers interact with their frontline workforce. They understand you don't need to control people to get things done well. And this applies to unskilled workers as much as it applies to skilled workers. They recognize the need to support all staff to work to their highest potential, to facilitate their work and their further development as contributing members of the organization, to enable their full participation in decision-making, and to validate their knowledge, experience, and expertise. By cultivating and then drawing on expertise from across their organizations, they allow a more holistic narrative to develop about what's working, what's not working, and how they can improve things. A narrative that reflects complexity far better than a handful of KPIs can ever do. Now, it's not about valuing the staff above management. It's about valuing them more equitably. And it involves engaging meaningfully and, dare I say it, routinely with frontline workforce. Now, while the solution is not all that difficult to understand, I do see a few hurdles to its widespread adoption. Firstly, we have institutionalized, quite literally, the belief among managers that they need to demonstrate their superior knowledge and understanding of every problem compared to the people they manage. It therefore becomes quite threatening for a manager to ask a person who works under them in the organization, "What can you tell me?" Because it looks like an admission that, well, maybe I shouldn't be paid more than you because, well, I should know this more than you do. So managers actually fear hearing from people who sit lower than them on the organization chart. And I think this is a major reason that some senior healthcare managers have been reluctant to take on our MIR approach, because the approach explicitly engages all levels of staff in a dialogue about what's working and what isn't. To get past this hurdle, I believe what we need to do more of is re-educating managers about what their role actually is. Help them to see they can actually become better managers by talking meaningfully with the people who are part of their team. If I were a senior executive hiring managers to an organization, I would tell them, you are there to support the work of your team members, not to flick past the challenges that are bestowed on you from above. If you're presented with challenges that create implications for how your team members do their work, don't just tell your team to get on with it and make it work, because making it work will only get in the way of them doing a good job. Instead, work in partnership with them to collectively determine the best way to manage the challenges. Bring your own ideas to the table as the starting point, sure, but be prepared to hear what your team members think, particularly if what you're suggesting seems unworkable to them. Don't imagine you know more about the work your team members do than they do. Ask them to tell you what they do and why they do it that way, and work together to find solutions to real or potential problems. Don't be afraid of hearing different perspectives. Remember that disruptive thinking can be important to innovation. Importantly, I wouldn't just say this to middle and frontline managers. I would tell this to managers at all levels of the organization, because buck passing is a gift that keeps on giving from the top to the bottom of an organization. The second hurdle is that staff in the front line are also sometimes reluctant to engage more meaningfully in problem identification and resolution. In my experience, this is a minority, but there are some people who actually like having something to complain about and don't mind if problems don't get solved. They may even block implementation of viable solutions. But I really do think this is a very small number of individuals. And what I've seen firsthand from observing MIR sessions is that when people who are not used to being listened to or consulted are given meaningful opportunities to contribute to team-based reflection, they generally take those opportunities with relish and participate with goodwill in the process. The third hurdle, and this is a big one, is that work plans do not have room in them for the time needed to do proper and regular team-based reflection. People are already overworked and are expected to do too much in their available time. So I believe we need to bite the bullet and recognize that redundancy and overlap need to be reinserted into staffing profiles to allow organizations to properly engage their staff in meaningful dialogue about routine work practices in the context of risk management and quality improvement. The fourth hurdle is the prevailing risk management mentality that I spoke about earlier, that says, if it ain't broke, don't try to fix it, and that sees trying to work on something that isn't an obvious problem as just a waste of time and, more importantly, money. With tight health budgets getting ever tighter, I can see senior executives balking at the idea of spending precious budget on what they would perceive as low priority activities. But this is where some reframing of the way cost-benefit analyses are done would be worthwhile. The last hurdle is about how we have positioned quality and safety within organization structures. In healthcare, certainly, and possibly in other sectors, we have hived quality and safety off and placed it in a separate unit with its own manager, team, and even its own language. And then we've doubled down on that and made a big deal about what is called improvement science. So now you need a qualification and a credential as an improvement scientist in order to contribute to this. The people at the front line look at this and think, I don't want to be an improvement scientist. I want to be a clinician and treat my patients. So in effect, we have disenfranchised the very people who should be front and center of our improvement efforts. Now, I want to make it clear, I'm not advocating disbanding quality units, nor am I saying we shouldn't use improvement science methodologies. But I believe the quality unit or quality team should be there to facilitate and partner with the people who work at the front line. But they certainly should not be solely responsible for the whole process. What we need to aim for is a balance whereby every member of staff sees quality and safety as their business, not somebody else's business. So what I've spoken about today are the fundamental structural issues that I believe are the main reasons we have collectively not made greater progress in safety, quality, and risk management over the last few decades. There are, of course, excellent examples we can look to within all our respective sectors. But such is the nature of humans, we generally like to avoid structural disruption and lateral or quantum leaps in our attitudes and approaches. This is why we keep doing the same things over and over, tweaking a little bit here and a little bit there, and somehow, hopefully, expecting a different result, which, as Albert Einstein reminded us, is the very definition of insanity. What I will leave you with is the thought that every organization actually has within itself the essential ingredients it needs to turn its safety and quality outcomes around. Those ingredients are the knowledge, skills, and expertise of the organization's staff. And there are tools around like Meerkat and Nippon's Confidus and others to guide and facilitate organizations as they tap into these things. So just like Dorothy and her ruby slippers in The Wizard of Oz, we know the way and we have the means. We just need to find the will. So I'll stop there and take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Donna, for an excellent presentation. That was, again, really thought-provoking and interesting. I think your observations of the disconnect between executive and management levels and the front line, and possibly this widening delta between workers and management, describing work as done, and certainly the effort placed on managing perceptions of risk, they really resonate very much with me. I'll now hand over to James to field some questions. I know we've got a couple from a few people in particular, so we may actually allow those people to ask them in person. So over to you, James.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Donna. That was great. I'll start off right at the beginning. You said, obviously, you're not from a safety background, and there's a lot of ideas in there from a lot of different fields. I'm just wondering if you set about reading specifically outside, or certainly outside safety anyway, all these ideas and then putting them together, or how did you build your concepts in the first place?
Look, I think what it was actually conclusions that I came to from what I observed and how people were behaving and responding to what was happening, to what they were dealing with. And I just started to realize that we were looking at things the wrong way, that our priorities were quite wrong, and that we needed different approaches. And then I started reading the literature, mainly because I started writing blogs and thought pieces and coming up with, trying to write learned pieces. And then I saw that these were ideas that were out there, that other people were saying the same things or similar things, or had come to these ideas as well. So I'm not sure that I'm saying something that's necessarily completely out of the box or novel or different to what others have said before, but I think that I've come to it perhaps organically, simply because I was working in systems that weren't working, and trying to put things in place that are not happening the way they're supposed to happen.
Yeah. So when you bring these ideas into companies, I mean, my view is you're going to see a lot more benefits of engagement, even possibly well-being, this sort of stuff. I mean, have you seen that in reality when you start helping organizations in this way?
Absolutely. I mean, when you, I didn't do the research, but I sat and watched the project that was going on in a hospital, and it was actually inspiring to see the changes in the staff, where they actually felt that their views and their experiences were being validated and listened to, and it changed their approach and their attitude to what they were doing. They wanted to get involved. There was a huge increase in the number of frontline staff who put their hand up to take part in small quality initiatives, and they actually said somebody listened to what I had to say. Somebody heard what I had to say. They didn't, dismiss it, or it didn't disappear into a suggestion box or some random questionnaire that came out, once a year, or a staff satisfaction survey, which nobody paid any attention to, and everything that came back from higher up in the organization just simply seemed to not take account of anything that was really happening at the front line. So I saw the change in the staff. I saw the difference in the managers. We chatted to the managers who had participated in these sessions and who had worked on this project, and they said the transformation amongst their team members was really quite remarkable, and they wanted the initiative to continue, but the higher ups did not.
So when you talk about the higher ups, what created the cognitive dissonance in them to allow them to change their worldview enough because they're almost giving up control here, or the feeling, as you said, of being in charge, being the most knowledgeable and having the right opinion all the time and having to be in control. I mean, there's quite a change from the top down, I guess.
Yeah, look, the frontline managers, the frontline managers were on board. They didn't actually, this was not they don't actually like the command and control approach. They actually want to empower their team members. And particularly, you'll see that, nurse unit managers, who are the ones who are notionally the manager, the person in control of a particular unit in a hospital, they will delegate a lot of responsibilities to associate nurse unit managers, another tier. They have too much responsibility. They actually don't want to tell everybody what to do. They want people to take more responsibility. When you get into the middle levels of managers, you have some people who see the value and who understand that this is it's not about losing control or gaining control, but these are the wrong paradigms in which to be viewing it. They're actually seeing the empowerment of the workforce as being vital for the sustainability and viability of the organization. So we tended to find that there are people who already get it, and then when you come to them with a tool like the MIR approach, like Meerkat, and you say, what do you think of this? They go, that's exactly what I need. And then there are other people who are very resistant to it, and they'll sit and they'll look at it, and when they get an idea of what it's about, they're actually afraid of it. They don't want to have people in their organizations saying, hey, wait a minute, there's a problem with the things that you suggested that we do. Like the example that I gave about the uniforms. That's a real life example of where people were giving simple feedback of what you want to do. I understand it, I get it, but it's not really going to work from a practical point of view for us. Can we think about this differently? And the answer was just simply no. I don't want to hear what you have to say. I don't want to hear your point of view. And those people, obviously, I would say, are not ready to let go of that idea of the command and control structure. They're looking at it from, they're trying to protect a position rather than to, open to a different way of doing things, embrace a different way of doing things.
Yeah, nice. I'm just going to bring in Neil Richardson here because he's got a question along those lines. Hopefully that will work. You there, Neil?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Donna. Some really interesting points you made in there, and I've got lots of questions. I probably need to boil it down to one, really. But I often think that we're seeing the very same things in a modern day safety management era. I would argue that we saw in what we used to call the quality management days. We're still seeing ownership in the wrong place. We're still seeing a lack of flexibility. We still don't have those open channels and cultures and climates where people can raise their hands, concerns, everything you said, really. But equally, we've been doing this now for at least 10 years, and if not longer, when you go back into quality management days. So I'm just wondering, in your experience, what do you see as the real strategic blockers that are maybe not being spoken of? Because I think that's probably where the answer lies to some of this stuff. That you're right, at the very top, they've got their own challenges. But if we don't know what they are, how can anybody unblock those so that we all move forwards? Because we're kind of sailing around the same old island again, I believe, in safety management.
Yeah, no, Neil, I think you make a really excellent point. Well, the obvious blocker is the financial one. That, you know, if you are looking to trim everything to the bone, then the last thing that you're going to think about doing is paying your staff, you know, to sit around and engage with each other and have regular discussions about routine practices. And this is the whole attraction of, you know, lean thinking into the healthcare sector, which I think is a nonsense. I may be a little bit out in left field about that, but I don't actually think that lean thinking belongs in healthcare. And I think the pandemic has demonstrated the dangers of that. In Australia, certainly, we do not have enough workforce anymore to fill in the gaps of the people who have COVID and can't come to work. So we've overleaned our organization. So, but that is driven. I don't think people naturally gravitate towards lean as a matter of course. I think they gravitate towards it because what we're busy doing is, you know, tightening the budget so that there's less funding available to create those redundancies in your staff profile that allow you to spend time indulging, for want of a better word, in this kind of what they would call navel gazing. And they would say, well, you know, if there isn't actually a problem, why do you have to sit around discussing anything? And here I am saying, well, that's so that you don't develop problems down the line. You're trying to be proactive about this. And they're saying, well, no, we need to simply respond when things go wrong. And what we need to be is agile. We need to be able to respond quickly. That's the trick. Let's respond quickly instead of recognizing, but the horse is already bolted. The gate has already been opened and the horses have already bolted. So I think it's money is the main blocker. But I think it's also every organization I've ever worked in, and admittedly, I haven't worked to any great extent in the private sector, but everything is incredibly hierarchical. And there's a lot of personal pride in where you are in the hierarchy, and the idea of disrupting what that looks like, what hierarchies look like and what they mean, I think is very discomforting and very unsettling for people. I don't have a quick solution about that. Maybe the next generation of people who are coming along, who are used to, you know, gig economies and a whole different way of working, maybe the idea of hierarchies won't bother them quite so much. I don't know. Maybe it'll bother them more. Yeah, but money is going to be the number one blocker, I would say. And then, you know, this age old, this is how we structure organizations, I think is going to be another major blocker.
Yeah, yeah. And I think James, for everybody really, I think there's a real hidden potential in what Donna's just said, that if we have got organizations that have trimmed to the bone over the last X amount of years, you and I know we've had this chat before, where some of the interpretations we're seeing around risk management are actually beginning to eat into some of those safety margins that we had in the past. And I think that's the real danger for this industry, that we're kind of kidding ourselves we're managing risk, when actually what we're doing, we're taking more and more risk out of the system. And we don't realize it until it goes wrong. So I think that's a real danger for our industry, that we're potentially undoing all the hard work of the past.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I see that a lot at the moment.
Yeah,
with the
absolutely.
pressures of the pandemic. And I think because we're almost measuring safety as the absence of accidents, as you say,
Absolutely.
until something happens,
Absolutely.
you don't know you've done it wrong.
Yeah.
It gives the real problem there.
Yeah, thanks, James. Thanks for the question, that opportunity.
No worries, no problems. I've got one here from Richard Belford, who is, should managers spend more time working in the front line?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Should managers spend more time working on the front line?
Yeah, that is so interesting. So something very interesting has happened, particularly in healthcare, but in other organizations as well. There is a sort of professionalization of management. So a lot of people who end up in management positions and were never on the front line, they've gone straight in, you know, at some management level position. So they actually don't even really know how things work on the front line. But you see, I think that that's sort of missing the point. I don't actually think that the idea of having regular consultations between frontline staff, their managers, middle managers, and having senior people come and sit in on those conversations, the purpose of that is not to make everybody an expert in everybody else's job. The purpose of that is to allow the people who are in the position of making decisions to hear a range of perspectives and to allow those perspectives to inform the decisions that they're making. When we only make decisions based on the very narrow input of the people who are immediately around us and who are too busy managing up to sometimes even say, actually, I think that's a crap idea that you want to put forward there. If that's all we do, then our decision making is uninformed by the things that need to be taken into account in order to make the decisions the best possible decisions. Decisions are always going to be a trade-off. There's always going to be some consideration over here that's going to outweigh a consideration over there. And that's fine. I mean, I'm not actually talking about trying to make a system perfect, because I don't believe perfection is possible, but it is so far from perfect. And there has been so much effort that has gone into this. You have to ask yourself, what is the one thing that we've never actually done? And that is to, on a regular basis, sit down and talk about, reflect on what we do on a regular basis, why we do it that way, and how we think we could do it better. That's something that we just don't regularly do. Interestingly, when we train clinicians, we train them to be self-reflective. There's whole sections of their courses. They start off learning about self-reflection.
Yeah.
They graduate, they become qualified and registered, no time.
Yeah.
So I think we need to tap back into that thing that we teach them when they're still learning.
Yeah, very much. Excellent. I think we're going to finish there for time-wise. I think you finished off with a really good point. There's a question there from Peter Lachman, but that's a very health-specific question, so I'll let you do that in your own time.
Okay, fantastic.
Thanks very much for that. I'll hand back to Jodie now.
Thanks, James, and thank you, Donna, for answering those questions. I think we'll now take a quick comfort break before the final presentation today. So if you could please be ready to start again using the current Zoom link back at 15 past the hour, so that'll be 11:15 UK time. Thank you. See you soon.